Welcome to the story of my life that thrilled me and ended me at the same time. The silence in our bedroom had become oppressive. I felt a palpable heaviness in my chest as I stayed awake night after night. My husband, who had once been my comforting companion, was now really getting on my nerves. I studied the contours of his face in the pale moonlight filtering through the curtains, looking for traces of the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. But the lines around his eyes seemed deeper. He was tired, exhausted. I reached out, my fingers hovering just above his cheek, but at the last moment I pulled back, no longer feeling anything for him. I left my room in the morning when the sun was coming up, and then you left the sponge in the sink again. He muttered, his voice low and bitter. I huffed, my hand tightening around the cup I was holding. And you left your dirty socks on the bathroom floor. Again. As the days passed, our home transformed from a sanctuary into a labyrinth of closed doors and avoided spaces. I had to do something new, a new relationship if necessary. Without a conscious thought, I found myself pulling into the stony, rutted driveway, pulled by an inexplicable urge to get closer to this dilapidated structure. My neighbor had a horse, Blaze. She said she wasn't going to take care of him anymore and offered me to take care of him. I accepted because I wanted peace in my overwhelmed life. As I got closer, I began to hear his beautiful voice. Peering through a gap between the wooden slats, I saw Blaze for the first time. He was standing in the horse stall, his rich chestnut coat shimmering even in the dim light of the stable. I did not regret accepting my neighbor's offer. My neighbor, an old man named Frank, seemed grateful for my company. He's been lonely since my Margaret died. He told me one afternoon, his voice husky with emotion, "I think she needs a friend." At the time I didn't realize how much I needed a friend too. As the days passed, I found myself spending more and more time with Blaze. His gentle presence offered a solace I couldn't find anywhere else. When I spoke to him, when I poured out my fears and frustrations in quiet whispers, he listened without judgment. Before visiting the stables, I started to pay more attention to my appearance. Dressing for a horse seemed silly, but consciously choosing my clothes and putting on a little makeup made me feel more like myself than I had in months. With each passing day, the contrast between the peace I found in the barn and the tension that awaited me at home grew sharper. I began to dread the moment when I would have to leave Blaze's side, returning to the maze of closed doors and unspoken promises that my marriage had become. One evening, much later than usual, I was loitering in the barn when I heard the crunch of tires. I looked out through a crack in the barn door and saw my husband's carriage pulling into our driveway next door. Had he come looking for me? I couldn't hide my uneasiness because my horse and I were in an obvious way. The realization that he hadn't noticed my absence hit me like a physical blow. I leaned against Blaze's warm flank, burying my face in his mane to stifle the sobs that ripped from my chest. The horse stirred, turning his head to stroke my hair lightly and comfort me as best he could. As I walked towards my house, each step took me further away from the peace I had found in the barn, and closer to the cold reality of my failed marriage. I paused as I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking slightly. I wondered if I should stay with Blaze for the night, but it was too early for that. When I went upstairs, my husband was already in bed, his back to my side. I got under the covers, careful not to disturb him. It would be bad for me if he woke up. The soft patter of the rain on the barn roof obscured the sound of approaching footsteps. I found myself face to face, not with Blaze, but with my elderly neighbor Frank, his weathered face creased with worry, looking past me to where Blaze stood in his stall, head bowed and ears drooping. "You spend a lot of time here," Frank observed, his voice barely audible over the steady rhythm of the rain. "Blaze seems to really like you. I'm not getting any younger," he continued, his gaze shifting back to Blaze. "And to tell you the truth, I haven't given him the attention he deserves, not since Margaret." His voice broke, choked with emotion. Frank cleared his throat, pulling me back from my reverie. "I was wondering," he began, his voice hesitant, "would you consider looking at Blaze? Permanently, I mean." I froze for a moment and thought for a long time. I opened my mouth to answer, but Frank raised his hand to silence me. "Don't answer now," he said in a soft voice. "This is a big decision. Think about it. Talk it over with your husband. Blaze deserves someone who can give him the love and care he needs." When Frank turned to leave, I felt an emotion so strong that it almost brought me to my knees. I found myself talking without conscious thought. "Yes," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "I will do it." Frank paused, one foot on the threshold. He looked at me, relief and sadness mixed in the lines of his face. With a small nod, he stepped out into the rain, leaving me alone with Blaze and the weight of my impulsive decision. I turned to Blaze, who looked up at the sound of my voice. His dark eyes seemed to look right through me, filled with an intelligence that both comforted and unsettled me. Slowly I reached out my hand and ran it across his velvet nose. "Well, son," I whispered, "I guess it's just you and me now." The next day I woke up at 6 a.m. and I was so excited. My husband was going to work, and I sent him off to work without a care in the world and without giving him the kiss of life. I quickly changed into my tightest miniskirt, choosing practical but beautiful clothes, a far cry from my usual hurried morning routine. The road to Frank's property was now familiar, every twist and turn as if it were yesterday. I pulled up to the barn to find Frank waiting for me, a stack of papers in his gnarled hands. We spent the next hour going over the details of my horses, care, his diet, exercise needs, and medical history. Frank's voice was husky with emotion as he handed over the reins, both literally and figuratively. "Take care of her," Frank said as he prepared to leave. "She's all I have left of Margaret." I nodded solemnly. My marriage, once a source of beauty, had turned into a battlefield of unspoken resentments and growing distance. Each stroke of the brush became a question I was afraid to ask. When had we stopped talking? When did silence become easier than confrontation? When did we start to see each other not as partners but as adversaries? As the days passed, I found myself paying more attention to my appearance before going to the stables. I told myself it was out of respect for my new responsibility, but a little voice in the back of my mind whispered that it was more than that. I started to put on my best jeans and put on some lip gloss. Although he didn't say anything at first, my husband noticed the change. I could see him watching me as I prepared to leave. A few minutes later, "You spend too much time in that stable," he said, looking at me a little sternly. "What's so fascinating about an old horse? He needs me," I said without looking at my husband. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in bright shades of orange and pink, I found myself reluctant to return to the barn. I dismounted and took Blaze to a small stream that cut through a nearby meadow. While he drank, I sat on the bank and ran my fingers through the cool grass. In that moment, with the fading sunlight warming my face and the soft sound of Blaze breathing beside me, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. And with that peace came a startling realization. I was falling in love. The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow and left me breathless. I wasn't falling in love with Blaze, not in the traditional sense, but I was falling in love with the woman I had become when I was with him. The woman who woke up each day with a purpose. Woman who faced challenges with determination instead of despair. And things would never be the same again. You'll be shocked to hear what I go through at the end. Just wait. I was going to try to bridge the growing gap between my husband and I. I was going to find a way to bring some of the peace and purpose I had found here in the barn back into our shared life. But even as I was making this decision, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. Was it too late? Had I already crossed the line, not in action but in my heart? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, a mixture of fear and dangerously close to excitement. When I went to the barn the next day, Blaze's stall was at the far end of the barn, shrouded in darkness. As I made my way towards it, every step felt like a decision, a choice I could not take back. The soft whisper of the hay beneath my feet urged me on, while a small voice in the back of my mind begged me to turn back. My hand reached out almost of its own volition to caress his neck. The touch was different this time. Where I had once found comfort, I now felt a dangerous excitement. My fingers traced the curve of his shoulder, marveling at the power beneath. The line between comfort and desire began to blur, the edges softening like watercolors flowing into each other. I leaned closer, inhaling his scent, earthy, primal, and intoxicating. My cheek touched his warm flank, and I felt myself melting into him. Time seemed to stand still as I explored this new zone of sensation. My fingers danced on his muscular shoulders, on his strong chest. I pressed myself against him and felt the steady thrum of his heartbeat. It matched mine, racing with anticipation and forbidden excitement. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to stop, to get away before I crossed a line I could never cross. But that voice grew weaker with each passing moment, drowned out by the roar of blood in my ears and Blaze's intoxicating closeness. I found myself whispering soft words of admiration and desire to him, my lips brushing his neck, tasting the salt of his skin, a texture unlike anything I had ever experienced before, at once familiar and foreign, comforting and exciting. My hands moved down, following the contours of his body. I marveled at the power within him, the raw power that could have easily overpowered me, but instead yielded to my touch. This sense of control over something so much bigger than myself was intoxicating. I lost track of time as I explored, each touch bringing me closer to a point of no return. The moonlight was changing, casting new shadows on the barn floor. It was as if nature itself was conspiring to hide our forbidden encounter, providing a dark cloak for my violation. I took the ring off my finger and carefully placed it on a nearby shelf, but there was no turning back now. I had gone too far, asked too much. Blaze moved, his strong body moving closer to me. My heart began to race as I realized what I was about to do. This was more than crossing a line. It was jumping over it recklessly. I took a deep breath and prepared myself for what was about to happen. The night air was perfect for what was about to happen. I reached for Blaze with trembling hands, ready to consummate this strange, forbidden love. What followed was a blur of sensations and emotions. The feel of his strong body against mine, the taste of his skin, the sound of our breaths mingling in the silence of the barn. It was primitive, raw, unlike anything I had ever experienced before. There was no gentleness, no whispered words of love. It was pure animal passion, driven by a need I didn't even know existed inside me. Time had lost all meaning. I was only aware of the sensations coursing through my body, the overwhelming feeling of fullness, the connection. It was painful and pleasurable, frightening and exciting. I lost myself completely in that moment. When it was over, I collapsed on the straw-covered floor, my body shaking. Blaze was standing over me, his strong presence both comforting and frightening. Slowly, I began to realize the realism of what I was doing. Shame was coming at me in waves, each one threatening to drown me. What had I become? I don't know how long I lay there, lost in a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, disgust fighting with lingering desire, shame fighting with a perverse sense of satisfaction. Finally, I forced myself to stand on shaky legs, my body aching in unusual ways, bearing the evidence of my betrayal. When I was getting dressed, my movements were very slow. She was lethargic and calm. I had trouble recognizing the woman looking at me, her hair wild, her eyes wide and haunted. Was this really me? Had I really done what I thought I had done? When I approached the house, I saw the light on in our bedroom. My husband was still awake. A new wave of guilt washed over me. How could I look him in the face? How could I lie down next to him knowing what I had done? Just thinking about his touch, once so comforting, shivers down my spine. I walked to the car and prepared to drive home. I paused at the door, my hand on the doorknob. For a moment I thought of running away. I could disappear into the night. I could leave behind this life I had completely destroyed. But where would I go? What would I do? The reality of my situation came crashing down on me. There was nowhere to run. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped inside. I opened the door with a forced smile on my face. My husband looked up from his book, concern written all over his features. He asked if everything was all right, noting that I hadn't been home for a long time. I mumbled something about Blaze being restless and needing extra attention, one more lie to add to the growing pile. As I was changing for bed, I could feel his eyes on me. Did he suspect something? That night's sleep overtook me. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and reliving the events in the barn over and over again. Part of me was disgusted and horrified by what I had done. But another part of me, a part I was ashamed to admit, longed to return to the barn, to lose myself once more in that primal bond. My husband's footsteps echoed down the hallway. Each time I became more and more panicked. I busied myself with the dishes, furiously scrubbing a spotless plate to avoid meeting his gaze. He entered the kitchen, and I could feel his eyes on my back, questioning, probing. The silence between us stretched, a yawning chasm filled with unspoken words and growing suspicion. "You came late last night," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Is everything all right?" "I just worked on my horse." I said, "It's really nothing. You can relax. You've been spending a lot of time outside lately," he observed as he poured his coffee. "I'm glad you found something that makes you happy." If only he knew the truth, how deep I had sunk. The secret burned in my throat like acid, threatening to spill out and destroy everything. I swallowed hard, tried to push it back down. I managed to say, "Yes, that was good for me." As the day progressed, I found myself going through the motions of normalcy. I answered emails, made phone calls, even chatted with a neighbor about her new garden. The real me was trapped somewhere deep inside, screaming silently, begging to be released from this prison of my own making. Then I made excuses, each more elaborate than the last. A forgotten jacket, a water trough that needed filling, a fence that needed mending, lies piled up like autumn leaves, covering the truth rotting beneath. What followed was a blur of emotion and shame, pleasure and self-loathing. When it was all over, I leaned against Blaze's warm body, tears streaming down my face. What had I become? How had I fallen so low? I don't know how long I stayed there, lost in my own misery. But eventually I pulled myself together, wiped my tears and straightened my clothes. I took Blaze back to his stall, my movements mechanical, lacking the tenderness that once characterized our interactions. On the way back home, I felt hollow, empty. Lies came easily now, spilling from my lips without hesitation. I told my husband I was helping a neighbor with an emergency. I made up a story about a sick cat and a hectic trip to the vet. That night, lying next to him in his bed, listening to his steady breathing, I felt more alone than I had ever been in my life. My world had shrunk to the space between the house and the barn, a prison of my own making. Everything else, my work, my friends, my hobbies had vanished, leaving only this twisted obsession. I entered the barn, the smell of hay and horses enveloping me like a crooked comfort blanket. Blaze hummed softly as I approached his stall, and for a moment I felt the surge of pure, uncomplicated love that first drew me to him. But when I reached out to caress her velvety nose, reality came back. This was not love. This was a disease, an addiction that was destroying everything good in my life. Yet I couldn't stop. The thought of giving it up, of facing the emptiness and guilt that awaited me at home, was unbearable. I took Blaze out of his stall. I felt like it, and I didn't know why. As I ran my hands over his strong muscles, I saw my reflection in the dusty mirror hanging on the barn wall. The woman staring back at me was a stranger. As I walked Blaze back to his stall, my movements slow and heavy with fatigue, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on a bale of hay near the entrance to the barn, lay my husband's jacket. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I saw. Had he followed me? Had he witnessed my descent? The thought sent a wave of nausea through me, and I had to lean against the barn door to keep from collapsing. I approached the jacket with trembling hands. As I got closer, I saw a piece of paper coming out of the pocket. With my heart pounding, I took it out and opened it. The note was short, just a few lines in my husband's familiar handwriting. "I know. I've known for a while. I wanted to understand you, to help you, but I can't watch you destroy yourself any more. When you're ready to get help, when you're ready to be the woman I remarried, I'll be waiting for you. Until then, goodbye." The world seemed to spin on its axis as he read the words over and over again. He knew. Years passed, but shame clung to me. I would stand at the edge of the pasture, watching the grass sway in the breeze, remembering the feeling of freedom I had once experienced on Blaze's back. But this freedom came at a terrible price. My husband's absence was a constant pain, a phantom limb from which I could never fully recover. In the silence of the night, I would trace the outline of my bare ring finger, feeling the weight of my choices more acutely than ever. I realized that some wounds are really too deep to heal. They become part of you, reshaping your essence, making it unrecognizable. And in those moments of clarity, I realized that the price of my obsession was a debt I would pay for the rest of my life. Don't you ever do anything like I did. I love you. Don't forget to subscribe and like for more.